Dear colleagues, leaving the field of medicine for 1 week, Markus at Home welcomes Professor Frank McDonough in Liverpool for our Christmas special in order to talk about his hot-off-the-press history book, The Weimar Years, Rise and Fall, which has widely been acclaimed by international critics in the last weeks as one of the most important history books of the year 2023. Dear Professor McDonough, dear Frank, it's a pleasure to host you again as our return guest. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Professor Frank McDonough is a globally acclaimed academic historian who studied history at Balliol College, Oxford, and gained a PhD from Lancaster University. He has published seminal books on the 20th century history, focusing upon the rise and fall of National Socialism in Germany and on the Anglo-German relations during that period. For our Good Friday special this year, we talked about his biography of Sophie Scholl. And in the meantime, Professor McDonough has published the third part of his trilogy on Germany between 1918 and 1945, which is actually a prequel to his books on the Hitler years, part 1 and 2. And by definition, the novel book covers the years from 1918 to 1933. And as for our Good Friday talk, my co-moderators are again Jens Benninghoff in Haar near Munich in Bavaria and Markus Säemann in Vienna, Austria. And we decided to split this talk into 3 parts. So Jens will take the first 6 years, the wild beginning of the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1923. Then Markus Säemann will cover the seemingly more quiet years between 24 and 29, and I will have some final questions then on the last years until 1933. Jens.
Well, yes, it's great to have you again, Frank, on this special holiday session from Markus at Home. And as Gunnar stated it in the beginning, I very much enjoy the reading of your book, and I haven't finished it, but I did my homework. So the first years are covered, and I think it's very interesting. And I would try to somehow get our kids interested in reading it during the holiday period, because it gives a great overview. It's very nicely written, and it's really like reading actually like a novel. It's so how you say, the plastic, the events. You're able to turn these events like a theater play. So it's it becomes very easy to follow the complexity and the cumbersome evolvements which we have at the end of World War I in Germany. So maybe for our readers, could you first explain what are all these circumstances, the turmoil Germany was in at the end of World War I, leading to this kind of revolution in November 1980?
I think you've got to start by saying that, Germany had just suffered a massive military defeat. So obviously that was going to destabilize Germany, whatever happened, because the German army had put so much effort into winning that war and dominating Europe. So really it was and also they'd taken the public along with them through propaganda and also through fighting. Millions of Germans had fought in the war, and their expectations were built up that they would win the war. So I think that whatever was going to happen to Germany after 1918, there was going to be a sort of crisis, because first of all, there was a revolution in 1918, a democratic revolution, but it was a rather strange revolution, because when we think of revolutions, we think of the French Revolution and the overthrow of the monarchy, and in fact the execution of the 2 monarchs in that revolution. We think of the Russian Revolution again. It ended up with the monarchy being executed again. Here we have a strange situation. The Kaiser, the monarchy, is got rid of through agreement, although you could say under duress, because Kaiser Wilhelm didn't want to give up the monarchy. And he went into exile. So he was sort of in exile for all that period. I think he died in 1941. the Netherlands monarchy wouldn't give him up to the Allies because they wanted to put him on trial. It probably would have been a good thing had he been put on trial, to be honest, to ram home the idea that Germany had lost the war. Now, the destruction of all of the monarchies of Germany, because of course there were monarchies in the local areas of Germany as well. So you had monarchies falling left, right, and centre. So Germany then adopted a democratic constitution signed in the spa city of Weimar. And so we get the Weimar Republic. Now, Germany had never really had a democratic system before that. It had had sort of limited democracy. The Kaiser, what we describe as, he was a sort of autocrat, really, because he could veto the legislation in the Reichstag. So it wasn't like Britain, where the monarch had no way of vetoing any legislation by the monarch. So there were sort of problems right from the get-go with the constitution. Then you had a strong, established sort of right wing in Germany, really, and they never really accepted the Weimar Constitution, and the civil service the same. They felt they owed allegiance to the Kaiser, and there was a strong movement, people forget this, among conservative circles, to bring back the Kaiser underlying this democratic government. And the main supporters of the democratic government were the Social Democrats, the official majority Social Democrats, and the Liberals in the centre, the DDP, and the Catholic Centre Party. And these were the main supporters of the Constitution. But, there was always these people who opposed the Constitution. The Conservative Party of Germany, the DVNP, the German National People's Party, it wasn't like the British Conservative Party where it was in power, it supported the state, it wasn't in favour of revolution of any kind. Actually, the DNVP moves more and more to the right, really. So it became difficult, and the Constitution held that there would be proportional representation. Now, as we know, that's not a bad thing. Most of the countries of Europe have proportional representation, and it works pretty well. Germany's had proportional representation since 1949, and it works pretty well in Germany. I can't think of many real political crises that have emerged in Germany since the war. But then again, the public are not against the democracy in Germany. But here, democracy was a new thing. It wasn't really something that Germans were used to. And so on top of that, the Allies instituted the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles implemented reparations, and the reparations were set at 132 billion. They sound like not quite a lot of money now, and in today's values, what is it? It's probably about 600 billion now, which doesn't seem a lot when you look at the massive budgets of governments these days. So I think that, and there was left-wing rebellion, there was right-wing rebellion. The left-wing rebellion came with the Spartacus Revolt. That came in 1919, and that was put down by the Freikorps. These were these sort of trigger-happy soldiers who were taken on as mercenaries, a bit like the Wagner group, actually, in Russia at the moment. And they had saved the Republic. Now, it wasn't really a good look for a government that was supposedly progressive and left-wing to be saved by a group of right-wing militarists. And the Freikorps saved them again when there was a revolution in Munich. The Freikorps came in and saved the government again. So here was a government nominally democratic, relying on right-wing sort of elements.
Well, Frank, it's I mean, you name it, the Wagner Group. So it's easy for us nowadays to look back at these events and somehow comment them. But I think it's interesting to draw a parallel. And you're saying the Wagner Group. So the influence of the Bolshevik Russia is very interesting here too. I was not really aware that through the Russian embassy in Berlin, money was funneled into to the uprisings in the late 1918 and 1919. So about 1 million, they say, and it was to buy weapons.
The German Communist Party, KPD, took money from Stalin all the way through into the early part of Hitler coming to power. And it was something of a kind of creature of the Soviet Communist Party. In fact, the Soviet Communist Party would deliver orders through the Comintern to the leadership of the KPD. So the KPD wasn't really a popular movement of the left. It was actually a group of, intellectuals who sort of forced their ideas onto the party, bit like the Bolshevik Party, really, which was an insurgent party, really. And then they tried to bring in the mobs on the streets around their ideas. But what you've got is political chaos, really, because you can't form a coalition government without 3 other parties. And that's a recipe. It was a recipe for doing nothing. And a lot of these Weimar governments, the national governments, don't do much. It's in local government where the SPD actually is prominent, where we see the social changes that we associate with Weimar.
It's really a great story, and it's worth reading it from page to page, and it's just astonishing. And it's always like it's not only a tragedy; it's also somehow a comedy. When you look at how in Bavaria, sitting here in Munich, I think it's very very funny to read how the revolution in Bavaria took place. There's this famous anecdote about one guy telling the king, Ludwig III, my Majesty, it's revolution, please go home. When he was asking what was happening in the streets.
Sort of regime of the poets as well in Bavaria, in Munich. You get the revolution of the poets. I mean, their foreign minister is a complete lunatic. I mean, he declares war on Switzerland. He complains that Hoffman, the SPD leader, has stolen the key to the toilet. And then Toller, who's the leader, comes back and he says he's obviously
really a fun part.
Obviously put him in a sanatorium. So you've got the sort of comedy of it, where the communists aren't very good at these revolutions. That they're sort of pretty much what we call in Britain cock-ups. They don't work really. I think the communists never looked like gaining power through revolution. And after 1923, they don't even try to gain power by a revolution, the communists.
Yeah. And then it was this how would you describe it when Hitler turned up with the beer hall putsch? And it's I think in speaking in Lenin
was a common
terms, he was like the useful idiot maybe for the monarchy.
But that was the Hitler attempt in November 1923 was a comedy as well. All he took over was beer hall, and he didn't even do that successfully, and it didn't last for more than a few hours. The Munich beer hall putsch is only important in the sense of Hitler being arrested and sent to prison and changing his mind about how to overthrow the government. He decided then that he'd do it the legal way, he gained power, then destroy the democratic system. So it was a change of tactics, but an important one, because although it looked impossible for Hitler to come to power in 1924 when he was in prison for high treason, he did come to power eventually, and he did come to power legally. He was invited legally by the president to form a government.
Yeah. What was about the trial on Hitler? Do you think many say that he just became popular because of the trial on the beer hall putsch? What would you say?
Well, the trial took place in sort of March and April of 1924, and the judge, who was a right wing figure, he allowed Hitler to give long monologues and speeches that were sort of on German nationalism, and he sort of ended up saying, "We're not the criminals. The criminals are the national government and Airbus, and they should be on trial for treason for what they've done to this country." And that kind of got widely reported. I think it's a mistake, though, to think that Hitler was famous at that point. He was, how can I put it, mildly famous. You know, that kind of regional figure who sometimes comes into the national news, but you don't really know who he is, and you haven't got sort of a lot of information about him, really. So I think he was a regional figure, well known in Bavaria, obviously, and then he was more well known for this trial. But it didn't really sort of immediately result in the Nazi Party gaining loads of members. In fact, they lost membership after the trial, and they were banned anyway. So it took the Nazi Party, 3 or 4 years to recover to its abysmal showing. Even in 1928, they only got 2%, 2.8% of the electorate. So it didn't have any tangible effects at the time. Of course, circumstances favored Hitler after 1929, but they were completely different. They were not due to Hitler's fame in that way. They were due to problems with the government Weimar system.
So, Frank, just to sum up these first few years, from a revolution to the kind of more stabilized period from 1924. So, what would you just say? Could you say that there's one mistake which should have been avoided, which might have changed the whole picture?
I think the biggest mistake Germany made was not to try and pay the reparations and try and work with the Allies, coexist with the Allies, and try to build bridges with the Allies. If they had done that, if their governments had not been so belligerent and not paying, if you don't pay things, people knock on your door and say, give me the money, don't they? Now, Germany was a bad debtor. There's no doubt about that. It wasn't just a bad debtor. It seemed as though it was like a spoiled child. I'm not going to pay this money over. And of course, that just inflamed the Allies, and it especially inflamed the French, because, of course, most of the war had been fought on French soil. Most of French industry and mining had been destroyed, and they wanted the money. They needed the money. When you look at the breakdown, I think France was due to get 60% of the reparations, and Britain was supposed to get 13%. So Britain wasn't really in this fight with a dog, really, if you know what I mean. They could afford to be more sort of appeasing towards Germany, whereas the French couldn't. People lambast the French and say the whole problem of that period was due to the French hating the Germans, and that was the real problem of that period, and forcing them to pay the reparations. Now, it takes two to tango, doesn't it? The Germans weren't paying the reparations. And in the end, the French decided, well, if you're not going to pay them, and there was no way of getting them to pay through a normal system, signing a check and giving it. They were just defaulting all the time. So the French sent in their army and the Belgians to try and enforce payment. Now, that proved to be a political disaster because, of course, the policy of passive resistance meant the French weren't getting the goods that they thought they would get by sending in their armies. But I sort of think that Germany made a mistake. It had a democratic government. I mean, the Germans were saying, oh, we're a democratic government. Why are you saddling us with all these problems? See, they were saying to the Allies, oh, go easy on us. Now, the French needed the money. It's like sort of when you phone up your credit card holder, you've maxed your credit card out to the limit. You phone them up and say, oh, could I just not pay you back? Because I haven't got any money. They won't let you do that. And that was the point, wasn't it? The debts had been set and the German government were not accepting them. That was the real problem of that early period. Of course, that led on because they wouldn't cut public expenditure and raise taxation. That led on directly to the hyperinflation. So Germany really caused most of its problems, really. The hyperinflation was caused by Germany refusing to cut public expenditure and deciding just to print money. Now, that was a conscious decision. Now, it wasn't a conscious decision. It seems as though when you look at the actual documents and the government, you don't actually see a policy of saying in the government, oh, let's bankrupt our society. They don't really know where this is heading. The point is, if you start off an inflation like this, you're going to destroy your currency.
Yeah. So I will now pass on to my colleague from the other victim of World War I, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. I pass over to Vienna. Thanks, Frank, a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So now, before coming to the more stable years, 24 to 28, with a lot of diplomatic finesse, in principle led by Gustav Stresemann, who I think was a very stabilizing factor in the Weimar years, and I think had a lot of diplomatic successes, even though he was opposed inside of Germany. What is often overlooked is, nevertheless, after the First World War, the consequences were that there was a lot of unstable situation outside of Germany. You know, all these different states with coalitions that were very dubious. So, as you wrote, also the Eastern Locarno, for example, they relied on France, but France was not really strong enough to give assurance to the eastern side. There were dictatorships like in the south of Eastern Europe. The Serbs dictated the Slovenes and Albania and so on. So this was a very unstable situation on top of an economic situation. And may I quote Golo Mann, who is a former colleague of you, a historian, because he was a contemporary and as he saw the situation, the Germans before 1914 had laughed a lot, even in politics. Wilhelm II made sure of that. Now they had just stopped laughing, no celebrations either, no solemn, joyful or more intimate contacts between the ruler and the governed. It would be unthinkable that the Minister of Education would have discussed things with his students and spoken to them. When the Republic no longer existed, I called this empire without an emperor in my diary. That was what it had been, the crippled, impoverished empire without the old position of power in the world, without the fleet, without the military parades, without triumph, splendor, and pomp, without the protection that the crown provided, despite the ridiculousness of its holder, still had bit. Yes, literature flourished, architecture, painting, music, theater, and so on. But all these good things are not actually attributable to the Republic. So it was simply a progression from what was going on in arts, in science, from the monarchy. So now we are in the stable phase, and we saw a proportional behavior of a better economic background and an impossibility, as you alluded, of the far right and far left parties. And I think this is a very important thing that you describe. Although, for example, with 24, Hitler was only a minority program, it was the nucleus, what was then going on. And you brilliantly characterized, and it was psychologically for me very important, because you wrote, for example, after the process, that, for example, he was impressed by Hitler's speeches, but this feeling soon faded as he gradually realized Hitler's speeches always say the same thing. In his conversations with Hitler, he soon realized that Hitler regarded himself as the German Mussolini, had lost all his sense of proportion, refused to listen about Lossow. Or Seiser admitted that he found Hitler a compelling speaker at first, but soon thought Hitler had given into megalomania in the days leading to his attempted coup. So I don't think Hitler changed at all during these times. He was always the same. And those that were somehow full of their senses, they should have realized he was a complete sick guy, at least from his mind. But how did the things then change? That was it the death of Stresemann? Was it this situation of this always alternating governing parties? That's all these problems, give rise to this phenomenon.
I think in the period, this, as you call it, the stable period, I think you've got to give a lot of credit to Stresemann, mainly because he decided, like I was saying earlier to your colleague, he decided that Germany, being a bad boy of Europe, was not going to be a policy that was going to work. And so he saw that, Germany really had to start to get realistic. It had to balance the books. That meant it had to cut public expenditure, which it did. And mainly it had to get on with the French. I think Stresemann at one point says, unless we can convince the French that we don't want another war, then there won't be peace. And so he makes a tacit attempt to appease the French. So the appeasement comes from Stresemann in the 30s, it comes from the West. But in the 20s, it comes from Stresemann, who says, look, we've got to get on better with the Allies, with the British. He knows the British are sort of favourable to German revisionism of the Treaty of Versailles, and he knows the French are not. So the aim of Stresemann was to actually make concessions. The concessions that he made led to the Locarno treaties. And you've got to say that was Stresemann's idea, because in the book I show that he initiates the original negotiations. He sends a memorandum around to the French and to the British, who are favourable to it. Now, that agreement, the Locarno treaties, they guarantee the Western frontiers. So it means that Germany accepts the Western amendments of the Treaty of Versailles. It means they accept that the Rhineland will be demilitarized, they accept all the loss of territory in those areas. Of course, it doesn't give an Eastern Locarno. It doesn't actually guarantee the eastern borders. So the corridor in Danzig are still up for grabs. But Stresemann says we won't attempt to revise those unless there's a negotiation or there's a referendum in those areas. So he hasn't given up on those aims in Eastern Europe, but he's going to do it by negotiation, not by war. Now, that pays off, because you get kind of, I think Stresemann, Briand, Austen Chamberlain, they all win. And the guy who devised the recovery package, Charles Dawes, the American, they all get the Nobel Prize for Peace for doing this. And then Germany becomes so Germany then joins the League of Nations. Again, another sign of Germany sort of rebuilding after the Second World War. And then Germany signs the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounces war. Here's Germany seen as a warmonger, renouncing war. It may not seem much now, but it was then. It was seen to be a big concession. Again, another triumph for Stresemann, because he signs the Kellogg-Briand Pact. In Paris, he goes all that way, even though his health is not very well. So yes, I think that in that period, Germany starts to get a way of dealing with the Allies that actually succeeds. Now, if Stresemann had carried on like that, and there was sympathy, wasn't there, for Germany's plight, there's a good chance that if Stresemann had lived, and he was only in his early 50s, and carried on with that kind of policy, then a revision of the Treaty of Versailles that Hitler sort of did by, marching into places, he probably could have got all that for nothing. And that's the difference, isn't it? He probably could have got up to the point at which Hitler was threatening Poland about 7 years earlier. So I think Stresemann, brought the stability. Obviously, the loans from America helped as well. So Germany did stabilize, and we've seen in recent times, haven't we? There used to be a thesis on British history, which was called the empty belly or stomach, the empty stomach thesis, which said that when there was riots in Britain, it was at times when people had no money, they couldn't eat properly. And we see that today, don't we? We see there's flux, but there's economic underpinnings to that flux, isn't there? There's high inflation everywhere. There's failure to recover from the pandemic and supply lines and all the rest of it. So it's similar. We've got economic problems and we've got political problems on top of those. And in that period when Germany was able to get a line of credit or whatever, then it was good. But of course, then came the Wall Street crash.
Yeah, and parallel to this time, because you brilliantly in one sentence characterized such demonic people like Joseph Goebbels. You said his propaganda approach was simple: find out what people hate and make them hate it more. He dismissed truth and accuracy as irrelevant to the art of propaganda and instead made a virtue out of lying. So I think,
right.
yeah, I think this is also relevant for our current times now.
Well, that was Nazism, wasn't it? I mean, popular Nazism as well. We must remember Nazism was a form of populism. You know, we tend to forget that. Well, it was a form of populism. You know, they wanted to be popular, but unlike populists who seize on issues, Hitler actually created issues and then pushed them forward. One big issue that Hitler put forward was that the Weimar system didn't work. That here you had coalitions coming and going, you know, chancellors coming and going. He said, you know, you probably could recognize your local shopkeeper more than the German chancellor. So you didn't have German chancellors who had any charisma as well. So, you know, people have said, oh, there was a power vacuum in Germany. The German governments had not become popular. They'd not created popular leaders. And how are you going to sustain a democracy without popular leaders? All they were, you know, people said, oh, they were like a succession of, accountants or undertakers. You know, they were sort of solemn figures, you know, usually with horn-rimmed spectacles and usually bald. You know, there was like, that's the way they looked. So it was difficult. Hitler, compared to them, he looked dynamic. So when he said he was going to transform Germany, it seemed believable to a lot of people. In fact, it was believable to the middle classes, because people need to remember that Hitler's popularity increased with the middle classes, first of all in the rural areas, and then in the big cities, the suburbs, the affluent suburbs of the big cities. So it wasn't a moronic appeal, Hitler's appeal. Hitler's appeal was one to say, we need to get rid of this democratic system because it doesn't work. We need an autocratic system. And, you know, a majority of Germans, it wasn't a massive majority, but by 1932, 51% were voting for parties in the Nazi Party and the KPD who wanted to overthrow the system. Now, a democracy really is in a lot of trouble if you've got a majority of voters who don't want that system.
So what fascinates us about the Weimar years are these burning questions. How was it possible that Germany went into the catastrophe with Hitler being the chancellor and the NSDAP got into power? And so you said it's not primarily what is common thinking, that it's primarily the economic collapse or the economic crisis that gave rise to this problem. So when it comes to these years, as you now said about Hitler, is it maybe the absence of any party giving at least the feeling of a vision?
Similarity with Brexit in Britain, you know, everyone assumed, you know, Britain would always be in the EU. There was no chance. And when we started the Brexit referendum, you know, personally, I thought there's no chance of this going, you know, the opposite way. But, you know, some people have said, you know, there's like sort of the silent majority, that what these polls and things don't pick up is the silent majority. There were always a group of people in Britain who didn't like Europe. They didn't like closer relations with Europe. And the people who were the Remainers sort of forgot about that and thought, well, so, you know, they're never going to be a majority. And here in Germany, the same was true of Hitler. Yeah, he spouts off about he's going to have a dictatorship, etc., etc. That's never going to happen, you know. So there was a lot of sort of a lot of underestimation of Hitler. Now, Hitler himself, just like the Brexit people, they made it simple: get out of Europe, take back control. Hitler's manifesto was similar. It was get out of the democratic system, take back control, and have a dictatorship. And that was what he played. I mean, I show in the election speeches, he doesn't mention the Wall Street crash. You can't say the economy is affecting people and they're voting for Hitler. If they are voting for Hitler on his program, then he wants to get rid of democracy. All of his speeches are full of this idea: I will come to power and I will destroy this corrupt system. This corrupt system doesn't work. There's been, you know, umpteen coalition governments and none of them have succeeded in doing anything. You know, and we're a laughingstock in Europe. You know, the Allies have been pushing us around for years. So this was something that resonated in people's hearts. That's what I'd say. So really, usually, like with the Brexit vote, in the sort of rational heads of the Remainers, there was no chance of Brexit happening, and they underestimated it. And the same thing happened in Germany, I think, that this was a tide, a rising tide. And where it helped Hitler was that Hindenburg had already decided he wanted to destroy democracy as well. So you've got two things happening. You've got Hitler, who wants to destroy democracy, but he can't do it on his own. And Hindenburg, who wants to destroy democracy by creating a popular right-wing authoritarian presidential dictatorship. And he does this from March of 1930. He has Brüning, who he brings in as an austerity chancellor. He bypasses the Reichstag. He governs by decrees. The Reichstag hardly meets then in 1931, 32. It hardly meets at all. Then he gets fed up with Brüning's austerity, and he moves to Franz von Papen, and he's even worse. He's like, they call him a Nazi in a pinstripe suit. Then they move to General von Schleicher, and he's deeply unpopular as well. And so von Papen convinces Hindenburg that he can get his popular dictatorship through Hitler by surrounding him with conservatives, and that way he'll get what he wants, which is a popular dictatorship, the destruction of democracy. So a lot of people want to destroy democracy, including the president. Now, if you've got a president with powers who wants to destroy democracy, and you've got a party in the Nazi party who also wants to destroy democracy, inevitably those two are going to meet at some point. But so although Hitler had gone on with this presidential dictatorship, leaving Hitler out, at some point he was going to try Hitler, I think.
But despite the fact, and this is interesting regarding the German society, including the academics at the universities, unmistakably the program of the NSDAP always had these irrational elements. They didn't hide it. So it was anti-Semitism, it was this Lebensraum concept. They always told more or less the truth. We want to destroy democracy, it doesn't work. We hate Jews. We will eliminate all this kind of stuff, Auslöschen in German.
We hate we'll get rid of the communists.
Communists or the Bolsheviks, or what, as a common theme for everything that is unfriendly to us. So they were, and when I read the contemporaries, what was going on at different universities, in the University of Heidelberg, for example, so a lot of students in the beginning of the 30s, they were extremely pro National Socialists. Despite these obvious irrational arguments.
They appeal to the upper middle classes. So usually where university students wouldn't be in favor of a party like the Nazis, they were for reasons like you said, get rid of democracy, we'll be more dynamic. And democracy was failing, remember, democracy was failing not just in Germany. The British national government came to power, didn't it? And the Labour Party was destroyed in the early 1930s. In America, they had the New Deal. In France, they ended up with a Popular Front. So it wasn't just Germany that was unstable. It was all the democracies. Democracy didn't look like a way that could get itself out of this economic crisis. And that was a big factor. That was the big theme that Hitler was playing on. You can't depend on democracy to get you out of this. And as you say, there are going to be benefits. Once we cleared out all these Jews from all these prominent positions, there'll be jobs for German people. So it was a nationalistic theme as well. And we'll go back to having a clear idea from a dictator telling us what to do. There was a hankering after the Kaiser, wasn't there? And Hitler could represent the Kaiser. Hindenburg was trying to turn himself into the Kaiser by using this Article 48 of the Constitution. So it all resonated, really, to say, let's get rid of democracy.
But Hindenburg, I don't want to defend him, but he was hesitant to appoint Hitler.
Yes, it was, because he was trying his own idea. What I'm saying is Hindenburg was trying his own idea towards an authoritarian right-wing dictatorship. and therefore Hitler didn't fit that. He didn't fit that because he didn't feel as though he could manipulate Hitler. So that was the only thing in the way of Hindenburg. And also, he didn't want a party leader. Hindenburg wanted individuals who were not associated with parties, you know, to be the leader. So that was holding him back. Should I appoint a party leader? Oh, no, I don't think I will. That was holding him back. But in a way, eventually, he was persuaded that Hitler was worth giving a chance to try out, to see whether he could be the popular authoritarian leader who could create a dictatorship. But they all wanted to create a dictatorship, you know, and the left was very weak at that time. The SPD had fallen in power. It was the defender of democracy. But in the end, it didn't defend democracy. There was no general strike. There were no big demonstrations. They just folded in. They just put up the white flag.
Gunnar, you come to the final phase.
Yeah, we are actually right in the middle of the final phase. But my first question would be, Frank, when reading your book, one question that came to my mind is whether we are really correct to fix January 1933 as the end of the Weimar Republic. Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor that day, sure, but it was within the constitutional framework. And then we had gradually the Enabling Act, the death of Hindenburg. And then on the other side, looking to the years between 30 and 33, this was no longer actually at least a parliamentary democracy. So are we correct in having this fixed date at the end of the Weimar Republic?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think personally that the decision of Hindenburg to appoint Brüning, then to exclude all the left-wing parties from any future coalitions and to have a presidential, really a presidential dictatorship, really. I think that ended Weimar, because Weimar didn't function then as a functioning democracy, because, of course, it was being subverted by President Hindenburg. Hindenburg said he was ruled by decrees, and he did. He issued well over 150 decrees between 1930 and 33. So you could say Germany wasn't a functioning democracy. How can you have a functioning democracy when in 1932 the Reichstag only meets a handful of times? You know, it's hard to have a democracy where there's no parliament. So he'd taken away the parliament's power to do anything, and everything was being done by his chancellor, who was being backed up by these presidential decrees under Article 48 of the Constitution. So you could say that there was a kind of interregnum. There was a kind of, this period from 30 to 33 is Hindenburg deciding how is he going to create his dictatorship. He tries the presidential dictatorship, and that doesn't really work. He's sort of gradually forced back into having remember, Hitler comes to power as part of a parliamentary coalition. And that's completely different. Hindenburg hadn't wanted that. Now, there's some idea that the SPD had decided that they were going to try and impeach President Hindenburg under the powers they had and under the Constitution. And he'd heard about this, and he started to get worried. You know, there's no doubt that people around him said he started to worry about the idea of the SPD and some other parties taking an impeachment procedure, because he thought that would impact on him and his son, who had gained money through this kind of agricultural farm procedure. And so there was thoughts of, you know, his son might come under scrutiny for having gained, you know, embezzled money and all the rest of it. So that was tinkering under the surface, whether they go for that. You know, and there was talk, wasn't there? Schleicher said he wanted a dictatorship where he suppressed all the parties, and Hindenburg said, I can't go along with that. Now, Hindenburg didn't want to go along with that state of emergency situation then, because he feared it wouldn't get it through. Now, with the Enabling Act, he went along with it. So within 3 months, he decided he will go along with the idea of Hitler creating a dictatorship. But it was, you know, what you've got to remember is, all of these things that happened were supported by Hindenburg. You know, in the end, Hindenburg is opposed to Hitler come to power. Then he gives in and says, we'll bring him into power, but we'll surround him by conservatives and we'll control him. And then when he comes to power, pretty soon he signs the Reichstag decree, doesn't he? That basically takes away everyone's civil rights with the sweep of a pen. Then he sort of goes and he supports the Enabling Act, doesn't he? Then there's the famous meeting at Potsdam, where he declares in favor of Hitler's changes. Then Hitler asks him to sign the suppression of all the political parties in July, and he signs that. So, you could say that, Hindenburg was the kind of, I say in the book, that Hindenburg was he was the gravedigger of the Weimar system, and Hitler was the undertaker, appointed by Hitler to get, to bury the body.
Was there any possibility for the Republic to survive in 1933? So it looks as if the NSDAP actually had kind of exceeded its climax of popularity, and they are slightly losing elections, and they were short of money. So some people say, well, it may have been one of the last possible time points for Hitler to be appointed. So
it was.
Yeah.
I think that Hitler's popularity was falling then, slightly falling. 2 million, lost 2 million. But of course, they all came back. Once he came to power, he got more votes when he came to power. And once he had the sort of, the paraphernalia of power, his popularity went up. Hitler was very popular. The point is that he took to the job, then he started doing dynamic things, and he became popular. I think some people think, he's the most popular dictator there's ever been. When you go into the late 1930s, people used to say in Germany, oh, we had wonderful times in the 1930s. I talked to people who were in the Hitler Youth. I had interviews with them, and they look back almost with tears. Oh, it was wonderful. We were all together, and if only the Führer had seen that, we had a united society and we didn't need to, and all that kind of guff, it's kind of like, the Allies did a public opinion poll, I think it was 1947 or something like that, because they wanted to find out, were there still people who supported Hitler? And I think it was 63% of the Germans said Nazism was a good idea, but in the end it was badly applied.
Yeah.
So I think that, were Germans hankering after this? Well, it's a bit like before Beatlemania happened. The youth probably did want a popular group, who all looked the same, and sang songs with love in them, and you could probably say, well, Beatlemania was inevitably going to happen because all these teenagers were ready and going. And I think the German people wanted to sort of recover themselves to that period before the First World War, when they were, if you like, a great power. So that was a big thing, as well as psychological as well. I think the whole thing is very psychological. It's very psychological what happens to Germany. It's hard to explain really how it happened to a civilized society, and how it went from having these wonderful sort of art and culture and all that, and to Hitler and his sort of marching people through the streets, and people did come out. We've got to be honest about this. 2 million people came out when he came back from his victory in France, for example. So, let's not run away from the idea. Nazism proved popular. Whether the anti-Semitism was popular, well, that's another point, isn't it? Although we now see there's evidence being sort of coming to light of German courts that's showing that there was a lot of humiliation of Jews going on, even in 1933, when we thought that the main humiliation and violence was against the communists. We're now seeing, when we look at these local trials, that people were humiliating Jews, dragging them through the streets and, shaving their heads off and things like this. And that was happening in 1933. So I think there was a tide of anti-Semitism there, especially in the Nazi Party, and the Nazi Party never really gave up on anti-Semitism. Yes, Hitler toned it down for the elections and didn't mention it too much, but underneath on the streets, anti-Semitism was there, and we know, don't we, that the Nuremberg laws came about because the stormtroopers were taking matters into their own hands in the local areas. So anti-Semitism was was there. The idea of overturning the Treaty of Versailles, that made Hitler the most, interestingly enough, that made Hitler the most popular when he announced his reoccupation of the Rhineland, when he announced his, occupation of Austria, when he gained that victory in the Sudetenland as well. Hitler's popularity had never been higher then, showing that the Germans favoured the overturning of the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler had a lot going for him, I think, with the German people. And as I said to your colleague before, what we underestimate is that, Nazism wasn't just favourable to bully boys on the streets, who drank, flagons of steins of beer. It was also popular with university students, with teachers, with lawyers. Let's not mention doctors, because we know, don't we, that doctors were big supporters of Nazism, and in fact participated in the atrocities in the camps. And there was a doctor's trial, wasn't there, after the First World War? And these are normally people who you don't associate with extremism. You don't expect your local doctor to be going on a march with the Nazis. That's not what you expect. So the pillars of society came round to Hitler. Okay, the aristocracy didn't like him, and were always saying, "Oh, he's an uncouth corporal," but they went along with it. That was the Mitlaufer, they called them, didn't they? The person who went along with what was going on. And I think, that was because of the violence as well. People went along with it because they didn't want to suffer the violence. And partly some of what Hitler was doing appealed to them.
But don't you think that economy played an important reason, especially Breuning's politics? He had, I think, 68 emergency laws. He had a politic of fighting against deflation, and this was 31, 32, so they were really on the brink, on an edge in the population.
Economy. No, you can say that the economy had a massive impact. It had a massive impact actually on industry, really, and also it had a massive impact on the working class. So in actual fact, the people who really suffered from unemployment tended to be people who lived in big cities, tended to be people who voted for the Communist Party, and tended to be people who voted for the SPD. So in that sense, yes, the economy was bad, but it didn't actually lead on, if you like, to support for Hitler. Hitler had his lowest votes in working class cities where they had a strong union presence and they had strong communist and strong SPD. So that shows that Hitler gained support in affluent suburbs of Germany from civil servants and people like that. People who feared that they would lose their job, but they hadn't actually lost their job. And that was true how he broke through in the rural areas. He broke through with self-employed people in the rural areas as well. So it wasn't the unemployed even in the rural areas. So I think as well that the government itself made itself unpopular. They went for a deflationary, as you said, they went for a deflationary policy under Brüning, which made the economic situation 10 times worse, especially for public servants. So they were getting the wages cut. And those public servants started to move towards Hitler in the big cities, in the middle class professions. So I don't think it's just a case of saying, oh, well, it was the economy. You've got to see how did they feed through to the people who voted for Hitler. And it doesn't look like Hitler got his votes from the unemployed, but the KPD did. So you could say the economic situation affected working class people more, and it influenced them to vote for the Communist Party. And that explains why the Communist Party increased its vote from 1928 to 1933. In fact, it was still going up in that election that was mentioned earlier, November 1932. The communist support was still going up, whereas the Nazi support had peaked.
I love the statement in your book where you write, some politicians make an enormous difference, and he, referring to Säemann, was one of those who did. There are many people, in addition to Säemann, who did not survive these years, and many of them have been murdered. Erzberger, Rathenauer, also Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Eisner, surely. But looking back to the year 25, the presidential race between Hindenburg and Marx, who was the candidate of the, say, left-middle parties, was very narrow, and it might have been that Marx had won that presidential election. Do you believe, and I'm aware this is factual history and historians don't like that, but do you believe that this would have stabilized the Weimar Republic?
Probably, yes. I think that, if they'd kept Hindenburg out of power, that would have been a massive, because he would have retreated finally into retirement, and he was the towering figure of the right, wasn't he? So I think that if Marx could have won, and it was, as you said, it was only narrow. In fact, if the communist candidates had pulled out, then Marx would have won, interestingly enough. Although Hindenburg got new voters to vote for him in the second ballot. I think that, yes, there's many situations, isn't there? It's like, well, what would have happened if Hitler had been kept out of power? Germany was getting close to a civil war. I would think eventually, I know Schleicher was the chancellor of the army. I think the army probably would have been a figure from the army would have taken over. Like in Argentina, a junta, a military junta, that would have favored them. It could have been done if there was a civil war on the streets. So what were the Nazis going to do? I mean, were they going to, if they were kept out from power, were they going to have a street fighting capability? Well, it didn't look like the army was going to be defeated by the Nazis on the streets. It didn't look like that. So you either were going to have a regime that was a purely military regime and push that at the German people. Now, Hitler's regime was a military regime, wasn't it? It was totally militaristic, and supported by the army massively. So you could say that they got what they wanted, really. Hindenburg got what he wanted, except he didn't think Hitler was that popular autocratic leader who he could manipulate and control. And that was the problem. So it's hard to say. I think Germany would have carried on being an authoritarian regime in the 1930s. I'm not one of those who thinks, it would have gone into being a nice democracy. And no, there was too many sort of passions had been unleashed by the 1920s to simply go away. And there were too many people who wanted rid of democracy. I think democracy didn't stand a chance in Germany. It didn't stand a chance because all the people who you need to sustain a democracy didn't want democracy.
And it's surprising to see the German federal states fading away within just some months after Hitler was appointed Reichskanzler. So we are always proud of our federal state, also today with the Bundesrepublik Germany, but apparently in deep crisis, and the same might be also true for Austria, deep crisis, apparently federalism is not strong enough.
Yes. I mean, it's like one of those, somebody called it the German tragedy. It is a tragedy in a way, because Germany could have gone another way. They could have accepted democracy. They could have got on well with the Allies. There was a roadmap there, wasn't there, for Germany to become a democratic country, that was favorable with its allies, and then there wouldn't have been a war in those situations. But of course, once you add a person like Hitler into a regime, and then he's pushing for war, you change the situation. The whole thing changes. Hitler's a sign that, personalities matter in politics. A personality can make a big change. And we need to always keep that in mind as historians. The grand forces of history, as we call it, the economic forces of history. But in the end, it comes down as well to individuals and the decisions that they make. And also to voters, because remember, you have to say that it was the German people who put Hitler in a position where he would have been offered the chancellorship. If the German people hadn't have supported him, Hindenburg wouldn't have been doing anything with him. So there's that as well.
We will look forward to the US elections next year.
Yeah, well, maybe we won't.
How would you, one last question maybe, I was wondering, how would you teach history today to the youth? I think that's a pivotal part to prevail, that democracy will prevail.
We'd have to change the way we teach. I don't teach history anymore. I'm retired. But I think now you'd have to look at what's going on in the world now. Because, they always used to say there was Godwin's law. Have you ever heard of that? It's when you use Hitler in a statement to justify something in the present, you've lost the argument. So when you say that, Boris Johnson was just like Hitler, you've lost the argument, really. Now people are saying, but where does Putin fit into Godwin's law? And then you've got to say, well, here we have a figure who definitely can be compared with Hitler. There's no question about that. Then you've got Trump. And Trump is a figure who can be compared with Hitler as well. So you have got a change in the world. There's change in the world. There's tremendous flux, and there's local conflicts. There's problems in the Middle East again. There's economic problems. Inflation has come back. The old 1920s inflation has come back. So people have got to sort of look at the present as well now when they're studying Hitler as well, and see, are there some similarities now? Because it seems to me that there are some similarities now and some dangers of the modern world. People have said, there's two things that couldn't happen again: the Beatles and Hitler. Because you needed, a certain set of circumstances for the Beatles to become so popular all around the world. And mainly it was because, the recording industry wasn't as sophisticated back then. So people were likely to jump on just one group. Hitler, the same, the situation favored him. He was able to come to power in the same way. And that wouldn't happen again. It just wouldn't happen in the same way. We get a bit of warning and we'd sort of say, what are we going to do? But, what are you going to do? Look at Putin. Putin is defying all of the Western democracies, isn't he? My view, I think the Western idea of democracy, it's in decline. It needs reinvigorating by someone or some set of policies to make it work. It's not going to work anymore by just saying, yeah, but we support capitalism. And isn't capitalism wonderful? And people aren't willing to say capitalism is wonderful anymore. So capitalism has lost its popularity, which I think led to a resurgence under Reagan and Thatcher, a resurgence of the Western ideal, that capitalism was great. That was the Reagan-Thatcher idea, wasn't it? And therefore, democracy is great because capitalism is great. Now, capitalism now doesn't seem that great, does it anymore? It doesn't seem to lead on and on to progress. It seems as though it leads to constant, economic downturns, problems, trouble, harder to live in this society, etc. So I think the Western ideal is under threat. It's under threat. And you've got these huge amounts of the world where they don't believe in democracy. China, Russia, parts of the Middle East, parts of South America. So you could say that, that's the problem. Western democracy and capitalism are in crisis.
May I ask you two final questions from my part for the last years of the Weimar Republic? So the first one would be, do you believe that a monarchy might have stabilized Germany? Surely not the Kaiser, also not the Crown Prince, who apparently was kind of a lunatic guy, but there was, at least in Bavaria, a Crown Prince who was supporting democracy, who was fighting, at least passively, against National Socialism. And we always see surely the British example of a stabilizing factor of monarchy.
I think that probably if Hindenburg had brought back the Kaiser, I don't think the Allies would have accepted that. So you've got to say, how can you do it? The Allies still had, didn't they, military superiority over Germany. And I don't see how you got that past the Allies, because the Allies were saying they wanted to put them on trial. So they couldn't sort of say, oh, yes, Germany's got a monarchy. I think that would have been worse than Hitler in the sense of selling that to the Allies. At least they could sell the Hindenburg had brought Hitler to power constitutionally. But I think that would have been tough for the Allies to stomach a monarchy coming back.
But they could have turned to the Bavarian alternative.
I think it's been shown that, I think it's someone reckons that at least 50% of the German people would have happily had the Kaiser back in the mid-1920s. So you don't know.
And at least in Italy, there was a possibility to bring Mussolini away from power because there was still a king. Surely it did not prevent.
The king sort of threw him out of power, didn't he? The king eventually threw him out of power. So the monarchy could have been a stabilizing factor, but the German monarchy didn't really have a great track record recently. What did you do before the war? How we started it,
My last question would be, you talked about the election system and you told that this proportional representation was not really the main reason for the failure of Weimar. But at the same time, we saw, I think, 12, 15 or so parties. And now we are back in Germany, at least. And again, I think Austria is somewhat similar, that we have 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 parties in our parliament. And it gets ever more difficult to found coalitions, which again, apparently supports the extreme parties. Whereas again, US or you in England or British have this first past the post system.
Yeah. I think that, people said even at the time, I mean, Franz von Papen said, if Germany could have had a 2-party system like Britain, with one party, he said, the Conservative Party being pro the state, then German democracy could have survived. That was the strength of the British system, was that the Conservative Party was always the party that supported the monarchy, supported the state. It never rebelled against those things. So that's what made the 2-party system in Britain stable. There was only ever 2 parties available. Now, Germany, if it could have had 2 parties, say it had say that its Conservative Party had been like the British Conservative Party, then it could have made a coalition with the SPD in those circumstances. So I think that was a problem, really. I think the problem was that Germany it wasn't just the parties, like you said about the parties. These parties just were class-based parties, a lot of the German parties at that time in the Weimar period. They just didn't have points of contact between each other. So really, the coalitions were just, what were they? Somebody said, they were just a doctrine of sitting on your hands, that everybody agreed to do nothing. And that's the way these multi-party coalitions work. You don't get anything done. That you can't be, you couldn't have got the National Health Service in Britain through Parliament in a coalition situation, could you? And the same is true for most of those radical reforms. I think, the more the parties proliferate, the harder it becomes to create viable coalitions. And if that's the case now in Germany and Austria, then you're in for trouble, aren't you? At least with Britain, if they turn on the Conservative Party, they'll go over to the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is not really a party that's against the state. We've never had a revolutionary Labour Party, a socialist Labour Party that wanted to overthrow the system. It's like Lenin's famous saying about the British. If I asked them to take Brighton railway station in a revolutionary situation, they'd first buy a platform ticket. So there's that tradition in Britain, isn't there? There's that tradition of accepting the state. And in Germany, there was a tradition of, taking orders and accepting the state. But once the Kaiser went, that went with him, didn't it? So, and people became rebellious. They became rebellious because the situation was terrible as well. I mean, you've got to remember the violence in Weimar Germany. I didn't mention it talking about it earlier, but, it's like I said in a book many years ago, in Weimar Germany, every night was all right for fighting. And if you're going home and there's fights on the streets and all that, it gives an impression that the system's gone, doesn't it? If you go home, you go home with your bratwurst and, walking along the street and having a nice time, but suddenly you see a load of communists having a big fight, you're not going to get home and feel relaxed about it, you know. So I think the violence was bad as well in the big cities.
Thanks so much, Frank. So I would suggest to end our talk by the last sentences of your book, which are really clearly showing why it is so important to get more information on this era. And you clearly state that the history of the Weimar years is a warning sign of how a democracy under poor leadership can drift towards a form of authoritarian rule that finally destroys it under the pressure of economic crisis and political instability. This is a question that continues to engage us today. I think that summarizes why it's so really up to date still for us. So are you going to write the fourth part then, either the First World War or the time after the Second World War, or was this the last?
I can't give information, but I can just say there's going to be another volume of the Hitler years. So it's going to be an aspect of Nazi, another big aspect of Nazi Germany. I think you can guess what it is.
All right. So we're looking forward to that, and we wish you a great remaining Christmas time and a healthy, peaceful, happy, blessed New Year. Thank you, Frank.
Oh, thank you. Happy Christmas to all, and Happy New Year. Let's hope things get better next year.